A new beginning. Mark Williams had spent the last 2 decades navigating the high-stress, demanding environment of a large city's police department. He had seen it all: crime, violence, corruption, and the complexities of modern policing. As a black officer, he had overcome barriers within the department and on the streets, where both colleagues and strangers sometimes viewed him with suspicion. His resilience and dedication to justice earned him respect, not just as a leader, but as a mentor to many young officers looking to make a difference in their communities. He climbed the ranks through hard work, integrity, and a genuine commitment to change the system from within. But now, after 20 years in the fast-paced, challenging urban police force, Mark was ready for a different kind of challenge. He'd recently accepted the position of chief of police in the small, secluded town of Clarksville. It wasn't just a new job. It was a chance to build something meaningful in a quieter setting, to guide a department in need of direction, and to inspire trust in a community with its own deep-seated values and traditions. Clarksville wasn't just a sleepy town with picturesque surroundings. It was known for its conservative outlook, with a tight-knit population that held onto old ways. Mark was well aware that he was entering as an outsider, and not just any outsider, but the town's first black police chief. As Mark drove his Jeep down the rural roads that led into town, he glanced at the trees and fields flanking the road. He'd always found a certain peace in nature, and after the long, grueling years in the city, the quiet of Clarksville felt like a balm. Yet, as serene as it was, Mark couldn't shake the thoughts racing through his mind. He knew the task ahead wouldn't be easy. Many locals had already expressed doubts about his appointment, murmuring concerns over an outsider leading their police force. He was also aware that some of the officers under his command might be resistant to his leadership, particularly since Clarksville's police department was an insular community with its own ingrained culture. Mark took a deep breath, reminding himself why he had taken this position. He wasn't running away from the city. He was running toward an opportunity to make a meaningful impact in a place that needed a fresh perspective. The thought filled him with purpose, even as he felt the weight of the expectations and challenges that lay ahead. Lost in thought, Mark didn't notice the patrol car speeding up behind him until it was almost on his bumper. A quick glance in his rearview mirror revealed 2 young officers in the squad car. He eased his Jeep to the side, expecting them to pass. But instead of moving forward, the patrol car cut sharply in front of him, forcing Mark to slam on his brakes. His Jeep jolted as he narrowly avoided a collision. Mark's heart pounded, both from the sudden stop and the realization of what had just happened. He watched the officers in the squad car, who seemed to be laughing, exchanging grins as if they'd just pulled off a great prank. They hadn't signaled, hadn't used their lights or siren. This was no official stop. It was harassment, plain and simple. He took a steadying breath, calming the anger that started to simmer inside him. He was no stranger to facing prejudice, and years of experience had taught him to control his reactions. But even for him, this was difficult to swallow. Mark reminded himself of the role he now held and the responsibility that came with it. The last thing he wanted was to give these officers any reason to twist the narrative against him. He would remain composed, observe, and handle the situation professionally. The squad car pulled ahead briefly before slowing down again, allowing Mark to catch up. Just as he drew closer, the patrol car swerved again, cutting him off for a second time, forcing him to brake abruptly. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. He could see the 2 officers clearly now. The driver, a younger officer with a cocky grin, and his partner, slightly older but equally amused. To them, this was a game, a harmless bit of fun at the expense of a driver they didn't recognize and likely assumed didn't belong here. Mark was no longer just angry. He felt a profound sense of disappointment. This behavior, reckless and unprofessional, was everything he had hoped to change by coming to Clarksville. It was one thing to face hostility from the public as a law enforcement officer, but to see it from within the ranks of his own department, even if they didn't know who he was, hit differently. He considered briefly revealing his identity, maybe turning on his interior lights to flash his badge. But he quickly dismissed the thought. This wasn't the time or place. He was still a stranger to these officers, and any confrontation here, on this isolated road, could easily spiral out of control. Instead, he chose to observe, to gather his thoughts, and wait for the right moment to address this behavior once he officially stepped into his role. After a few more minutes of their reckless maneuvers, the officers seemed to tire of their game and sped ahead, leaving Mark to continue his journey in peace. But just as he thought they were gone, the patrol car slowed down again, pulling to the side of the road until he caught up. This time, they stopped completely, forcing him to come to a halt behind them. The driver's door opened, and the younger officer swaggered over to Mark's Jeep. His expression was smug, laced with arrogance and disdain. As he approached, Mark rolled down his window, meeting the officer's gaze with a calm, steady expression. "License and registration," the officer demanded, barely concealing his smirk. Mark raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on his lips as he retrieved his license. He handed it over without a word, watching as the officer inspected it. The officer's eyes narrowed as he read Mark's name and details, but he didn't seem to recognize him, or perhaps he was too focused on asserting his dominance to even care. "Nice Jeep," the officer sneered, glancing at the vehicle. "Seems a bit fancy for someone like you. Got a lead foot, do you?" Mark resisted the urge to respond, keeping his face neutral. He knew exactly what this officer was trying to do, bait him into a reaction, something they could use to justify their behavior. But Mark wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. He simply watched, his silence more powerful than any retort he could offer. The officer scoffed, glancing back at his partner, who leaned against the patrol car, watching with a grin. "Let me guess," the officer continued, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can just drive however you like out here? This isn't the city. Out here, we keep things in order." Mark felt his patience wearing thin, but he maintained his composure. He had encountered this type of arrogance before, the kind of officer who thought his badge gave him power over others, especially those he deemed out of place. It was frustrating. But Mark reminded himself that he was here for a reason. He'd taken this job to confront exactly this type of behavior, and he wasn't about to lose control now. "Is there a problem, officer?" Mark finally asked, his tone calm but firm. The officer's smirk faltered slightly, surprised by Mark's composed response. "Just making sure you're following the rules," he replied, regaining his bravado. "People like you tend to think they can get away with things out here, but we keep a close eye on strangers." Mark met his gaze, his eyes steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just passing through." The officer studied him for a moment, then shrugged, apparently satisfied that he'd asserted his authority. He handed back Mark's license with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Watch your speed. Wouldn't want you getting into trouble on your first day." With that, he turned and walked back to the patrol car, exchanging a final smirk with his partner before they drove off, leaving Mark alone on the quiet road. As he watched them disappear into the distance, Mark felt a mixture of frustration and determination. This was not how he'd envisioned his arrival in Clarksville, but it was a powerful reminder of why he had taken this position. He knew he had his work cut out for him, not just in winning over the community, but in reforming a department that clearly had its share of issues. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air calm his nerves. Then, with renewed resolve, he started his Jeep and continued down the road, ready to face the challenges awaiting him. He had a mission to fulfill, and he wasn't about to let a few misguided officers stand in his way. Unseen challenges. Mark's thoughts weighed heavily as he finally entered Clarksville's city limits, leaving the unsettling encounter behind him on the empty country road. But the anger still simmered within him. It wasn't just the behavior of those officers that bothered him. It was the realization that this kind of attitude might be deeply ingrained within the department he was about to lead. Mark had always believed that leadership wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about setting an example, fostering respect and creating an environment where people felt safe and valued. But if that brief encounter was any indication, he had a long road ahead of him. Clarksville itself was a picturesque town, with tree-lined streets, modest houses, and a small downtown that looked like something out of an old movie. There was a charm to it that Mark found appealing. Yet the more he drove through, the more he sensed the subtle tensions underlying the town's quiet facade. He noticed the occasional glances from pedestrians, eyes lingering on him a moment too long, as if marking him as someone who didn't quite fit. He'd experienced this before, of course, but in a place as small and tight-knit as Clarksville, he knew these perceptions would be harder to shake. Eventually, Mark arrived at the Clarksville Police Department headquarters, a modest building with a brick facade and a small parking lot. He parked his Jeep, took a deep breath, and stepped out, reminding himself that he was here for a purpose. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his tie, and walked up the steps, feeling the weight of his new role settle over him. Inside, the department was abuzz with activity. Uniformed officers moved through the halls, some talking in small groups, others handling paperwork or phone calls. As Mark entered, the room seemed to pause, conversations quieting as officers and staff turned to look at him. Some recognized him immediately, while others wore expressions of surprise or curiosity. The silence hung heavily, the air thick with unspoken questions. Just then, a middle-aged officer with graying hair and a serious expression approached him. He extended his hand, his gaze assessing. "Chief Williams," he said, his voice formal but polite. "Welcome to Clarksville. I'm Deputy Chief Tom O'Connor." Mark shook his hand firmly, meeting his gaze with a nod. "Thank you, Deputy Chief O'Connor. I'm looking forward to working with you and everyone here." O'Connor gave a tight smile, though his eyes held a glint of skepticism. "The team is eager to meet you, sir. We're a close group here in Clarksville, and things are different from what you might be used to in the city." Mark noted the subtle hint in O'Connor's tone. It was both a welcome and a reminder that he was, indeed, stepping into unfamiliar territory. "I understand," Mark replied calmly. "Every department has its own culture. I'm here to listen, learn, and see how we can work together to serve the community." O'Connor nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "If you'd like, I can show you around. It'll give you a chance to meet some of the officers." Mark agreed, and together they walked through the station, O'Connor introducing him to various members of the department. Some greeted him warmly, others with a cautious politeness. A few officers he recognized from their files, having reviewed personnel records prior to his arrival. He saw names and faces, some open and curious, others closed and distant. As they walked, Mark noticed two officers near the back of the room, speaking quietly and casting glances his way. He recognized them instantly. The young officer with the cocky smirk and his older partner, the same two officers who had harassed him on the road. Mark's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. O'Connor must have noticed Mark's attention shift, because he gave a faint smile. "Those two are Officers Blake and Murphy. Been with us for a few years now. Good officers, but they can be a bit rough around the edges." Mark met O'Connor's gaze, reading the subtext. He sensed that O'Connor was aware of their flaws, but perhaps tolerated them, or even saw their behavior as part of the culture he had alluded to earlier. Mark simply nodded, filing away the information for later. As they continued the tour, Mark was introduced to various department heads and administrative staff. He took note of the equipment rooms, the holding cells, the dispatch center, and even a small break room where a few off-duty officers were playing cards. The station was smaller than he was used to, but it was well organized and had a certain rustic charm. Eventually, they reached Mark's new office. It was modest, with a large wooden desk, a few chairs, and a window that overlooked the main street. There were framed photos on the walls, showcasing past chiefs and snapshots of the department over the years. It was clear that tradition held a strong place here, and Mark respected that. But he also knew that some traditions needed to be questioned if they perpetuated harm. O'Connor left him to settle in, promising to return shortly with a few documents for review. Alone in the office, Mark took a moment to collect his thoughts. He leaned back in the chair, gazing out the window at the quiet street. He thought about the responsibilities ahead, about how he would have to balance earning the respect of his officers with holding them accountable. The encounter with Blake and Murphy had already shown him that change wouldn't come easily here. Just as he was lost in thought, there was a knock at the door. Mark looked up to see a young woman standing in the doorway, holding a notebook. She was dressed in a crisp, professional manner, with a name tag that read Officer Sarah Lopes. "Chief Williams?" she asked, her tone polite but with an underlying hint of excitement. "I'm Officer Lopes. I wanted to introduce myself and welcome you to Clarksville." Mark smiled, gesturing for her to come in. "Thank you, Officer Lopes. It's a pleasure to meet you." Lopes stepped inside, her demeanor respectful yet open. "If you don't mind, sir, I'd like to say that we're really excited to have you here. I've heard a lot about your work in the city, and I think there are a lot of positive changes you could bring to this department." Mark was taken aback by her openness, but grateful for the support. "I appreciate that, Officer Lopes. I know change isn't always easy, but I believe we can do some great things here if we work together." She nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly, sir. Some of us have been wanting to see more accountability and, well, a fresh perspective. I think having you here will be good for everyone." Mark sensed that she was one of the few in the department who welcomed change, and he was grateful for her support. "Thank you, Officer Lopes. I'm here to listen and learn from everyone. So if you have any suggestions, my door is always open." They spoke for a few more minutes, with Lopes sharing her own experiences in the department and some of the issues she'd noticed, particularly around discipline and accountability. She seemed earnest and dedicated, and Mark made a mental note to keep her close as an ally. After Lopes left, Mark returned to his paperwork, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had expected resistance, but the underlying attitudes he sensed were more ingrained than he had anticipated. Blake and Murphy's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper culture within the department, one that tolerated or even encouraged certain behaviors under the guise of camaraderie or tradition. Later that evening, Mark called his wife, Janet, who was still in the city wrapping up their affairs before joining him in Clarksville. They had been married for over 20 years, and she had been his constant support through the challenges of his career. "How's it going, Mark?" she asked, her voice filled with warmth and concern. Mark sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's going. The town is nice, but the department is going to be a bigger challenge than I thought. There's a culture here that's resistant to change. I ran into a couple of officers who gave me a pretty clear sign of how they feel about outsiders." "Are you okay?" she asked, worry evident in her tone. "I'm fine," he reassured her, "just frustrated. But you know me. I didn't come here expecting things to be easy. I came here because I wanted to make a difference. It's just going to take more time than I thought." Janet was silent for a moment, then said, "Remember why you took this job, Mark. You've always been someone who's willing to do the hard work, to fight for what's right. Just because they're resistant now doesn't mean they'll always be. You've made a difference before, and you can do it again." Her words steadied him, reminding him of his purpose. He knew that he couldn't expect overnight change, but he was committed to laying the foundation for it, no matter how long it took. "I know," he said softly. "Thank you, Janet. I needed that." They talked for a while longer, her voice a calming presence as he shared his thoughts and frustrations. By the time he hung up, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced challenges before, and he would face them again here in Clarksville. Change was never easy, especially in places where people clung to old ways. But Mark had never been one to back down. As he sat alone in his office, the quiet of the night settling around him, Mark made a promise to himself. He would lead this department with integrity, hold his officers accountable, and show them what true leadership looked like. He was here to serve and protect, not only the community but also the integrity of the badge he wore. And no matter what resistance he faced, he would stay true to that mission. Tomorrow, he would begin to make his presence felt, slowly but surely, one step at a time. And eventually, Clarksville would come to see that Mark Williams was not just an outsider. He was a leader that they could respect. Setting the tone. The next morning, Mark arrived at the Clarksville Police Department earlier than usual. He wanted time to gather his thoughts, review some documents, and prepare himself for what he anticipated would be a challenging day. Today, he would formally introduce himself to the entire department, outlining his vision and expectations. He knew this speech was critical. It would set the tone for his leadership and give everyone a glimpse of the changes he intended to bring. Mark sat in his office, glancing over his notes as he mentally rehearsed his speech. He didn't want to come off as overly authoritative, but he knew he needed to make it clear that he would not tolerate any form of unprofessional conduct. The incident with Officers Blake and Murphy weighed heavily on his mind, a reminder of the toxic behaviors he might be facing within the department. He couldn't help but wonder if other officers shared their mindset, or if some were simply going along with the status quo, hoping to avoid conflict. Around 8:30 a.m., Deputy Chief O'Connor knocked on his door and poked his head in. "Chief, the team's gathered in the briefing room whenever you're ready." Mark nodded, closing his notebook and rising from his chair. "Thank you, Deputy. I'll be there in a moment." As he made his way to the briefing room, he took a few deep breaths to calm his nerves. The hallways were quieter than usual as most of the officers had already gathered, awaiting his arrival. When he entered the room, all eyes turned to him. He scanned the crowd, taking in the range of expressions, some curious, others wary, and a few, like Officers Blake and Murphy, openly skeptical. Mark stepped up to the front of the room, placing his hands on the podium. He didn't need to clear his throat or tap on the microphone. The room was silent, every officer watching him intently. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the challenge inherent in their silence. He was the newcomer, the outsider, and they were waiting to see if he had what it took to lead them. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you for taking the time to be here. As most of you know, my name is Mark Williams, and I'm honored to serve as your new Chief of Police." He paused, letting his words settle over the room. "I know there's been a lot of talk about my appointment, about me being an outsider, about the changes I might bring. I'm here to tell you today that I didn't come to Clarksville to tear down what you've built. I came to help us build something better together." Mark saw a few heads nodding, though some officers remained stone-faced. He knew he had to address the unspoken tensions head-on if he wanted to break through the resistance in the room. "I want to acknowledge that I understand this transition might be uncomfortable for some of you," he continued. "I come from a large city department, one that dealt with complex and often intense situations. Clarksville may be smaller, but the values of respect, integrity, and service should be the same in every police department, regardless of its size. My goal is to bring those values here, to ensure that every officer, every civilian, and every visitor in our town feels safe and respected." He glanced at Officers Blake and Murphy, who exchanged a subtle glance, their faces betraying a mixture of defiance and amusement. Mark held their gaze for a moment before looking back at the rest of the room. "I believe in accountability," he said, his voice steady. "Accountability to each other, to the department, and to the community we serve. I expect each of you to hold yourselves to the highest standards, not because I demand it, but because it's what this uniform represents. We're here to protect, to serve, and to set an example. Anything less is unacceptable." A few officers shifted in their seats, and Mark noticed some furtive glances exchanged among certain groups. He knew he was challenging a deeply embedded culture, one that might resist even the slightest push toward reform. "Some of you may be wondering how I'll approach leadership," he continued. "I believe that a good leader listens before he acts. I'm here to learn from you as much as I am to lead. But I also want to make it clear that I will not tolerate unprofessional or unethical behavior. Disrespect toward each other or the public, abuse of authority, and any form of bias or discrimination have no place in this department." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "If any of you feel that my expectations are unreasonable or that this level of accountability is too much to ask, I encourage you to come speak with me. My door is always open. But understand this. This is not a suggestion. It's a standard. And it's one that I intend to uphold every single day." Mark scanned the room once more, meeting the eyes of each officer who dared to look up. He noticed Officer Lopes sitting near the back, giving him a small nod of encouragement. Her support steadied him, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his efforts. "I'm here to support each of you in any way I can," he concluded. "Together, we can make this department something that every member of our community can respect and trust. I know change isn't easy, but I believe it's necessary. And I believe that we're capable of achieving it together. Thank you." There was a brief silence, and then a smattering of applause from a few officers, mostly the newer recruits and a handful of veterans who seemed genuinely interested in Mark's vision. However, others remained silent, their expressions guarded or skeptical. Mark understood that this was just the beginning, and winning over some of these officers would take more than a speech. As the meeting adjourned, officers filed out of the room, some murmuring among themselves. Mark caught snippets of conversation, some supportive, others dismissive. He noticed Blake and Murphy huddled together near the door, their expressions smug as they exchanged whispered remarks. Mark couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could guess. He knew he had to address their behavior soon, but he wanted to gather more insight before taking any action. After the briefing, Mark returned to his office, ready to start his day. He had a full schedule of meetings with department heads, patrol supervisors, and community representatives. He wanted to get a feel for the department's day-to-day operations and understand the dynamics that governed it. Around noon, as he was reviewing case files from recent incidents, there was a knock on his door. Mark looked up to see Deputy Chief O'Connor, his expression unreadable. "Chief," O'Connor greeted him, closing the door behind him. "I wanted to check in after the briefing. Some of the officers, well, they seemed a bit tense. Change can be difficult for folks who've been here for a long time." Mark gestured for him to sit down. "I expected some resistance," he admitted, "but I'm not here to push anyone out. I'm here to build trust and set a standard of professionalism. That shouldn't be too much to ask." O'Connor nodded slowly, though his expression remained cautious. "I understand, Chief, but Clarksville has its own way of doing things. The department has always operated with a certain autonomy. Some of the senior officers, they've been here for decades. They're set in their ways." Mark leaned forward, meeting O'Connor's gaze. "With all due respect, Deputy, I didn't come here to maintain the status quo. I came here because this department has the potential to be better. And that starts with accountability, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for some." O'Connor hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I appreciate your perspective, Chief, but some of the officers feel that outside oversight isn't necessary. They believe they know this community better than anyone. And they don't take kindly to being told how to do their jobs." Mark's expression hardened. If their way of doing things includes intimidation, harassment, or disrespect, then it's my job to tell them how to do their jobs correctly. This uniform doesn't give anyone the right to act with impunity, Deputy. That's a lesson I'm determined to reinforce, no matter how resistant some may be." O'Connor's eyes flickered with something akin to respect, though his tone remained cautious. "Understood, Chief. I'll do my best to support your efforts. Just be aware that you're challenging a culture that's deeply ingrained here." Mark nodded. "Thank you, Deputy. I appreciate your honesty. But I've faced tough challenges before, and I'm not afraid to face this one. If we're going to build a department that truly serves this community, We have to be willing to change. After O'Connor left, Mark sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the uphill battle ahead. He knew that leadership wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about changing mindsets, and that was a far more challenging task than simply issuing directives. Later that afternoon, as Mark reviewed some files, Officer Lopes knocked on his door and entered with a hesitant smile. "Chief Williams, I just wanted to say that I appreciated your speech this morning. It's been a while since anyone talked about accountability around here." Mark looked up, offering her a warm smile. "Thank you, Officer Lopes. It means a lot to know there are people here who believe in the vision I'm trying to bring." Lopes nodded, glancing around to make sure they were alone before continuing. "I wanted to let you know that there are others who feel the same way. Some of us have seen things that don't sit right, but we didn't feel empowered to speak up. With you here, it gives us hope that things might finally change." Mark felt a surge of determination. "I'm glad to hear that. I want you and everyone else to know that this department can be a place of integrity and respect. It won't be easy, but together, I believe we can get there." Lopes nodded, her expression earnest. "Thank you, Chief. I'll do my best to support you." As she left, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he wasn't alone in his mission to reform the department, and that knowledge gave him the strength to keep pushing forward. There would be resistance, but there would also be allies, people like Officer Lopes who believed in his vision and were willing to stand by him. With each passing day, Mark was determined to turn that vision into reality. He would work tirelessly to build trust, to inspire change, and to show this town that a new kind of leadership had arrived in Clarksville, one that would demand respect, integrity, and accountability from everyone who wore the badge. Confronting the old guard, Mark knew he was making waves. By the end of his first week, he could feel the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, shift in the department's atmosphere. There were those like Officer Lopes who seemed invigorated by his arrival, hopeful that his presence might bring positive change. But others, particularly the older, entrenched officers, clung stubbornly to their established routines and attitudes. Mark spent his days getting to know the various departments, observing procedures, and gathering insights from everyone willing to speak to him. Each meeting was another piece of the puzzle, helping him understand the complex dynamics that governed the Clarksville Police Department. His approach was deliberate and careful, aware that any drastic moves could stir up resistance. But the more he saw, the clearer it became that certain attitudes were deeply entrenched, especially among senior officers who saw themselves as guardians of the department's traditional values. One such officer was Lieutenant Gary Sutherland, a veteran with nearly 30 years in the department. Known for his gruff demeanor and no-nonsense attitude, Sutherland was respected, if not exactly liked, by many in the department. He had seen the department change over the years, but he was still set in his ways. Mark quickly learned that Sutherland held a great deal of influence, particularly among the more conservative officers who saw any new oversight as an intrusion. Mark decided it was time to meet with Sutherland directly. He wanted to establish a rapport and gauge the man's intentions. Was Sutherland simply resistant to change, or was there something deeper, a loyalty to the old guard that might prove problematic? Late one afternoon, Mark found Sutherland in the department's break room, nursing a coffee. The older man looked up as Mark approached, his gaze cool and assessing. "Lieutenant Sutherland," Mark greeted him, his voice warm yet authoritative. "Mind if I join you?" Sutherland shrugged, giving a non-committal nod. "It's your department, Chief. Sit where you like." Mark didn't miss the slight edge in Sutherland's tone. He pulled up a chair and sat across from him, meeting his gaze directly. "I thought it was time we had a conversation, just the two of us. I've been getting to know the team, but I'd like to hear more about your perspective. You've been here longer than most, and I respect that experience." Sutherland's mouth twitched into what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I've seen a lot of chiefs come and go, that's for sure. Most of them just want to keep the peace, avoid rocking the boat. I can't say I understand why you came here, Chief Williams. It's a quiet town. Not exactly the kind of place for a city cop like you. Mark leaned back, keeping his tone measured. I came here because I saw an opportunity to make a difference. I'm not here to turn everything upside down, but I believe every department can benefit from a little introspection, a little accountability. Sutherland's expression hardened slightly, his eyes narrowing. Accountability. That's a word I hear a lot these days, and it usually means someone's coming in to tell us we're doing our jobs wrong. Mark kept his gaze steady, refusing to be baited. Accountability isn't about finding fault. It's about making sure we're living up to the standards this badge represents. I know that you've been here a long time, and I respect that. But I also believe that respecting the community means being willing to adapt when necessary. Sutherland's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Mark saw a flash of resistance in his eyes. With all due respect, Chief, Clarksville isn't the city. We handle things differently here. People don't want big city policing. They want officers they know, who understand them. They don't need someone coming in and telling them how to do things. Mark felt his patience being tested, but he remained calm. I'm not here to impose big city policing. I'm here to ensure that the people of Clarksville receive fair and professional treatment, regardless of who they are. That doesn't mean tearing down what's here. It means building on it, making sure we're setting the right example. Sutherland looked away, his gaze distant. Some folks might take that as a lack of trust, Chief, and in this line of work, trust is everything. Mark took a breath, deciding it was time to address the unspoken issue directly. Trust goes both ways, Lieutenant, and I'll be honest with you. I witnessed some behavior from Officers Blake and Murphy that didn't exactly inspire confidence. Sutherland's face remained impassive, though Mark saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Blake and Murphy. They're young, a little rough around the edges, but they're good boys, loyal to this department. Sometimes they get a little enthusiastic, but they're just doing their jobs. Mark held back a sigh, realizing that Sutherland's loyalty to his fellow officers ran deep, even to the point of excusing unprofessional behavior. I understand loyalty, Lieutenant, but professionalism isn't optional. What I saw wasn't enthusiasm. It was harassment. I don't expect you to agree with every decision I make, but I do expect you to support the standards we uphold. For a moment, the room was filled with a tense silence. Sutherland looked at him, his expression a mix of defiance and grudging respect. Understood, Chief, he replied finally, though his tone was clipped. If there's something specific you want me to address with them, I'll handle it. Mark nodded, sensing that he had reached as much of an understanding as he could with Sutherland for now. Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate your cooperation. I'm not here to make enemies, but I am here to make sure we're all on the same page. With that, Mark rose to leave, feeling the weight of the conversation lingering. He knew he hadn't won Sutherland over, but he had made it clear that he wasn't someone who could be easily swayed or intimidated. It was a start, and in a place like Clarksville, that was often the most one could hope for. As the days passed, Mark continued his work, meeting with various community leaders and attending town events. He knew that earning the trust of the residents was just as important as gaining the respect of his officers. He visited local schools, spoke at town halls, and listened to concerns that some residents had about the department. He was careful not to promise sweeping changes overnight, but made it clear that he was committed to transparency and fairness. One evening, he attended a community event at a local church, a gathering that brought together a diverse group of residents from all parts of town. The church hall was filled with families, teenagers, and elderly couples, all enjoying a potluck dinner and friendly conversation. Mark moved through the crowd, introducing himself, shaking hands, and listening to people's concerns. As he spoke with an elderly couple about safety in their neighborhood, he noticed Officer Lopes approaching. Her face lit up with a smile. "Chief Williams, good to see you here," she greeted him. Mark smiled, genuinely pleased to see her. "Officer Lopes, I didn't know you'd be here. Lopes nodded, glancing around at the crowd. I grew up here, actually. This community means a lot to me. I wanted to make sure they know that someone from the department cares about them. Mark nodded, feeling a sense of pride in her dedication. I can see that. It's officers like you who make a difference in the community. As they spoke, Mark noticed a few familiar faces across the room. Officers Blake and Murphy had entered, along with a small group of their friends. They were out of uniform, but their presence was hard to miss. Blake's gaze landed on Mark, and his face twisted into a smirk before he turned to his friends, whispering something that made them all laugh. Mark felt a twinge of frustration but pushed it aside, focusing on his conversation with Lopes. Still, he was keenly aware of Blake's lingering gaze, the open display of disrespect even in a community setting. After the event, as Mark made his way to the exit, he found himself face to face with Blake, who had deliberately placed himself in his path. The young officer crossed his arms, a smug expression on his face. "Nice speech, Chief," Blake said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Guess the folks here are buying into your little reform tour." Mark met his gaze calmly, refusing to be baited. "Good evening, Officer Blake. I'd suggest you remember that even off-duty, you represent this department." Blake's smirk widened, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "I represent this town, Chief. I know these people. I've been here my whole life. They know me, trust me. You're just passing through." Mark took a step closer, his tone measured but firm. "You're right, Officer Blake. You do represent this town, and that's exactly why your behavior matters. I came here to make sure we're all held to the same standard, because that's what true respect looks like." Blake's face hardened, the smugness slipping away as Mark's words hit home. For a moment, he seemed unsure, caught off guard by Mark's quiet confidence. "If you have any concerns about my leadership, my door is always open," Mark continued, his voice calm but unyielding. "But make no mistake, unprofessional behavior, whether on duty or off, will not be tolerated. That includes you, Officer Blake." Blake stared at him, his jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. With one final glance, he turned and walked away, clearly unsettled. Mark watched him go, knowing that he had made an impact, however small. He was determined to show Blake and the others that he wasn't a temporary fixture or a passive leader. He was here to make a difference, whether they liked it or not. As he walked out into the cool night air, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and challenges from those who clung to the past. But he had faced adversity before, and he was more determined than ever to bring integrity and respect to the Clarksville Police Department. The path to real change would be long, but Mark was prepared for the journey. With each day, he would build trust, hold his officers accountable, and show them what true leadership looked like. And eventually, he hoped, even the most stubborn among them would come to see that change was not something to fear, it was something to embrace. A test of integrity. The tension in the department was palpable in the days following Mark's subtle yet firm confrontation with Officer Blake at the community event. Word had spread quickly, as it often did in a small town, and every officer knew about the new chief's refusal to back down. Mark had anticipated some resistance, but even he was surprised by the intensity of the pushback. Some officers responded with outright hostility, others with passive defiance. Patrol assignments were suddenly forgotten, equipment misplaced, and reports left unfiled. It was a quiet rebellion, not enough to warrant disciplinary action individually, but collectively designed to test Mark's patience and authority. It was clear that they were hoping he would react, lose his composure, or give up and retreat. Mark, however, was determined not to let them get to him. He saw through their tactics and knew he would have to approach this situation strategically. He couldn't allow the department to become divided, and he refused to let a few resentful individuals derail the mission he had set for himself. His response needed to be measured, firm, and above all, unyielding. One morning, as Mark reviewed incident reports in his office. Deputy Chief O'Connor came in, looking unusually tense. "Chief, I thought you should know. Some of the guys are planning to request transfers out of here. They're saying the new way isn't for them. They don't like what's been happening since you arrived." Mark looked up, his gaze steady. "How many are we talking about?" O'Connor hesitated. "Around 6 or 7, mostly the more senior officers. They feel the changes you're pushing for are undermining the way we do things here. They're not used to being questioned or held accountable in this way." Mark wasn't surprised. He had anticipated that there would be those unwilling to adapt. If they want to transfer, that's their choice. But I'll say this, Deputy, what I'm implementing isn't some personal agenda. It's about respect, integrity, and professionalism. Those aren't negotiable. O'Connor shifted uncomfortably. "I get that, Chief. I really do. But some of these guys have been here a long time. They're good officers, and they've served this community well. They're just not used to having someone look over their shoulders." Mark leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "Deputy, I understand that change is difficult. I spent years in environments where every action was scrutinized, where accountability was part of the job. I'm not here to micromanage or undermine anyone, but the behavior I've seen, harassment, disrespect, insubordination, that has no place in any police department, large or small." O'Connor nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Understood, Chief. I just hope they'll see that too. I'll keep an eye on things and let you know if the situation escalates." After O'Connor left, Mark sat back in his chair, mentally bracing himself for what was to come. He knew that his efforts would be met with resistance, but he hadn't anticipated such a coordinated effort to undermine his authority. Still, he reminded himself that he hadn't come to Clarksville to make friends or to be liked. He had come to bring change, and that required resilience. The following week brought a fresh challenge. One afternoon, as Mark was preparing to leave his office, his phone rang. It was Officer Lopes, her voice tense. "Chief, I need you to come down to Main Street. There's a situation developing, and I think it would be best if you handled it personally." Mark grabbed his jacket and hurried out to his car, his mind racing. He arrived at the scene to find a crowd gathered on the sidewalk, murmuring anxiously. In the middle of it all stood Blake and Murphy, flanked by 2 other officers, with a young black man held firmly between them. The man, visibly shaken, had his hands cuffed behind his back, his eyes darting nervously between the officers and the onlookers. Mark approached Officer Lopes, who quickly briefed him. The young man, Dante Harris, was walking home from his job at the auto repair shop down the street. Apparently, Blake and Murphy stopped him, saying he fit the description of a suspect they'd been looking for. "But Chief, he doesn't match the description at all." Mark's jaw clenched as he processed her words. He'd dealt with these kinds of situations before, the kind where an innocent person was stopped, questioned, and humiliated simply because they fit the description. It was an excuse that had been used for far too long to justify discriminatory practices. He walked over to Blake and Murphy, who were standing guard over Dante, with smug expressions on their faces. They straightened slightly as he approached, but he could see the defiance in their eyes. "Officers, what's going on here?" Mark asked, his tone calm but firm. Blake stepped forward, his posture casual. "Chief, we received a report about a suspicious individual in the area, someone matching this man's description. We thought it best to check it out." Mark raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to Dante, who looked more frightened than suspicious. "And what exactly was the description?" Blake hesitated, and Mark saw a flicker of discomfort. "Well, tall, black male, dark clothing. You know, a vague description, but we thought it was worth investigating." Mark's patience was running thin. He could see right through Blake's excuse. "Officer Blake, do you have any concrete evidence connecting Mr. Harris to this alleged report? Did you witness him committing any crime?" Blake glanced at Murphy, clearly uncomfortable now. "No, Chief. We were just doing our due diligence." "Due diligence? Mark's voice was sharper now, and he could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. Due diligence does not involve harassing innocent citizens on the street. You didn't follow procedure. This is not the way we conduct ourselves in this department. Murphy shifted, his face flushing with embarrassment as the crowd watched. Blake, however, maintained his defiant stance, though Mark could see a crack in his confidence. "Take off the cuffs, now," Mark ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Blake's face twisted in frustration, but he complied, removing the handcuffs from Don's wrists. As soon as Dan was free, he rubbed his sore wrists, his eyes wary as he looked at Mark. Mark turned to him, his tone softening. "Mr. Harris, I'm sorry for what you've experienced. This was unprofessional and unacceptable, and I will be addressing this matter personally. If you'd like to file a complaint, please come by my office, and we'll make sure your voice is heard." Don nodded, visibly relieved, though his expression remained guarded. "Thank you, Chief," he murmured, before quickly making his way out of the crowd. Mark turned back to Blake and Murphy, his face stern. "My office." Now, the two officers exchanged uneasy glances before following him back to the department, the crowd dispersing as they walked away. The murmurs of townsfolk lingered in the air, and Mark knew that this incident would not be forgotten soon. It was exactly the kind of behavior that tarnished the reputation of an entire department, and he was determined to root it out. In his office, Mark shut the door and turned to face the two officers, his expression hard. "Do you realize the damage you just did to this department's reputation? You humiliated an innocent man in front of the community, all because of your own prejudices." Blake's face flushed with anger. "With all due respect, Chief, we were just doing our jobs. If he hadn't been acting suspicious, we wouldn't have stopped him." Mark's gaze bore into Blake's, his voice dangerously calm. "Acting suspicious. From what I understand, he was simply walking home. That's not suspicious behavior, it's everyday life. Your so-called suspicion was nothing more than an excuse to harass him. And you know it." Murphy looked down, clearly uncomfortable, while Blake remained defiant. "We have to keep this town safe, Chief, and sometimes that means making tough calls. Keeping the town safe does not mean abusing your power or targeting individuals based on their appearance," Mark replied sharply. "I came here to create a department that serves and protects everyone in this community, not just those who look a certain way. If you can't abide by that, you're free to request a transfer." Blake opened his mouth as if to argue, but Mark cut him off. "Consider this your warning. Any further incidents like this, and there will be consequences. I won't tolerate discrimination or abuse of authority under my leadership. Do I make myself clear?" Blake gritted his teeth, but he nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Chief." "Good." Dismissed. The two officers left the office, and Mark sat back, exhaling deeply. He knew that Blake's attitude wasn't going to change overnight, but he had drawn a line, made it clear that the old ways would no longer be tolerated. It was a small victory, but an important one. That night, Mark reflected on the events of the day. He knew he had ruffled feathers, that there were officers who resented his presence and his insistence on reform. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. He had to be consistent, unwavering in his commitment to integrity and justice. The next morning, he received an unexpected email from Dan Harris, thanking him for his intervention and expressing a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, things would improve under Mark's leadership. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Mark. It reminded him that his work, however difficult, was having an impact. As he walked into the department, he saw Lopes waiting for him, a determined look on her face. "Chief, I just wanted to say thank you for what you did yesterday. It meant a lot, to the community, and to those of us in the department who believe in what you're doing." Mark smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Officer Lopes. I appreciate your support. Change isn't easy, but with people like you by my side, I know we can make a difference." Lopes nodded, her eyes filled with respect. "We're with you, Chief, no matter what." Mark watched her walk away, feeling the weight of his responsibility, but also a growing sense of hope. The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, but he knew he was on the right path. He had set a new standard, one that would eventually permeate the department, regardless of the resistance. He wasn't just fighting for the department's future. He was fighting for the community's trust, for a legacy of integrity and respect. And he was willing to face whatever obstacles lay ahead to see that vision become a reality. Turning the tide. Mark had weathered the initial storm of resistance from his officers and demonstrated his commitment to holding them accountable. But he knew this was just the beginning. Real change required more than a few hard conversations and public reprimands. It demanded a shift in culture, a transformation of values, and most importantly, trust, not just from the community, but from within his own department. One Monday morning, Mark arrived at the Clarksville Police Department to find Deputy Chief O'Connor waiting for him outside his office, looking particularly anxious. "Chief," O'Connor began as soon as Mark unlocked the door, "we might have a serious problem on our hands. I thought you'd want to know right away." Mark gestured for O'Connor to come in, closing the door behind them. "What's going on?" O'Connor took a seat, glancing around to make sure they were alone before he spoke. "We've had a rise in anonymous complaints, mostly from citizens, about some of the officers. They're reporting incidents of harassment, excessive force, and discrimination. But what concerns me is that these complaints are primarily directed at Officers Blake, Murphy, and a couple of others who are close to them." Mark's face hardened. He had suspected that Blake and Murphy's behavior wasn't isolated, but he hadn't expected it to be so deeply rooted in the department. "Have you looked into these complaints?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. O'Connor nodded. "We've started to, but the officers involved are pushing back hard, denying everything and accusing the citizens of exaggeration. It's turning into a tense situation. Some of the younger officers who look up to Blake and Murphy are beginning to feel uneasy, worried about where their loyalties should lie." Mark leaned back in his chair, considering his next move. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the tipping point where he would either gain the respect of his department or face even greater resistance. He knew he couldn't let this slide, but he also needed to address it in a way that would demonstrate both fairness and firmness. "Here's what we're going to do, Deputy," Mark said after a moment's thought. "We're going to launch a formal internal investigation. I'll appoint an impartial review committee to look into these complaints and gather statements from both the citizens involved and the officers. I want this to be thorough and transparent. We're going to show everyone, inside and outside this department, that we take these issues seriously." O'Connor hesitated, clearly apprehensive. "Chief, an investigation like this is going to shake things up. The officers, especially those who've been here for years, are going to see this as a direct challenge." Mark met O'Connor's gaze, his expression unwavering. "Then let them. If we're going to be a department that serves and protects with integrity, we can't afford to ignore serious allegations just to keep the peace within our ranks. I need you to back me on this, Tom. This is about doing what's right, not what's comfortable." O'Connor nodded slowly, respect and a hint of relief in his eyes. "Understood, Chief. I'll do whatever it takes." The investigation commenced, and as expected, it caused waves throughout the department. Officers who had previously ignored Mark's leadership suddenly found themselves under scrutiny, their actions and decisions subject to review. Some responded with silent anger, others with open resentment. Blake and Murphy, in particular, made no secret of their disdain for the investigation, openly questioning Mark's motives and authority in hushed conversations that quickly spread through the department like wildfire. Mark was undeterred. He knew this was the hardest part, the moment when those who clung to the old ways would push back with everything they had. But he also knew that he had allies, officers who wanted to see a department they could be proud of, a department that would treat every citizen with respect and fairness. One afternoon, as the investigation was underway, Mark received a call from Officer Lopes. "Chief, "There's something I think you should know. Some of the younger officers, the ones who aren't as entrenched in the old ways, they're starting to question whether they're in the right place. They're afraid they'll be ostracized if they support you openly." Mark felt a pang of frustration. He had hoped his stance on accountability and integrity would inspire his officers, not intimidate them. "Thank you for letting me know, Lopez. I'll handle it." After ending the call, Mark decided it was time to address his department head-on. He knew that an investigation alone wasn't enough. He needed to reach out, to reassure his officers that his goal wasn't to dismantle the department, but to strengthen it. That evening, Mark called a department-wide meeting. He wanted every officer present, from the rookies to the seasoned veterans. As he entered the briefing room, he noticed the tension in the air, the wary expressions on many faces. Blake and Murphy stood in the back, their arms crossed defiantly. But Mark was undeterred. This was his moment to reach out to everyone, to show them the kind of leader he was.